Let's get started. So what I want to do today is to convince you that paying attention to changes in the conceptualization of the category like dementia can lead to insights about the multiple forces or vectors, as Ian Hacking would say, that form lives affected by such diagnostic categories and, as a looping effect, change categories themselves. I want to concentrate here, as I said, on the recent major changes regarding dementia prevention. So this was really a major change, in my opinion. It's a way of thinking that until recently was only possible at the margins of biomedical reasoning, and that, as I will argue, has both positive and negative implications for the wider landscapes of dementia care. Okay, so that sounds pretty abstract, and I decided therefore to bore you just very quickly with theory and then start with a more concrete example of change. So my theory I will call epistemic situatedness. Then I will talk about the new dementia as prevention. Of course, the news, as I call it, it's not an official diagnostic, just to make sure that you understand that it's a major change of thinking about dementia. And then I will throw at you different examples, and especially time-wise, so historical changes like this recent change to dementia as prevention, but also side-wise, so by juxtaposing different sides of what it means, dementia prevention. And as a conclusion, then I would like to discuss with you, I don't have an answer, but maybe you have ideas how to connect this kind of research with more phenomenological studies. And I think they're of critical phenomenology 2.0 by Cheryl Mathinghouse. So for example, that might be a connection we could think about. So as I said, epistemic situatedness, so this is really nothing new. I was inspired by Karen Knorr-Cettina's classical epistemic cultures, how the sciences make knowledge. And she talks about these are processes of knowledge making through types of reasoning, ways to establish evidence. And she also talks about epistemic machineries. And I think this metaphor is quite interesting because the way we frame knowledge has a major impact, is a major motor of cultural change. And so I hope this will become clear at the end. And of course, situatedness, all anthropologists among you will know, it's also not a new concept, and it means really that phenomenon like dementia prevention are embedded in, for example, as Chandler and Monday say, socio-historical, geographical, cultural context, social and power relations, and philosophical and ideological frameworks. And we could, of course, add now also more than human environments, etc., etc. And of course, everybody of you know Donna Haraway's situated knowledge, which probably comes first to mind when we talk about situatedness. And there's one point in Donna Haraway's text which I find especially interesting because she talks about responsibility and accountability also toward multiple existing and possible moral narratives. So I think the way we frame certain categories include moral narratives, as we will see. But she also says it's not so easy. So if you want to tell me the earth is flat, she thinks we have the responsibility also to be informed that there are alternative narratives or moral narratives about it. And as I said, I will throw at you several examples without really deepening each example of situatedness. But I hope that at the end, when all these examples come together, that we will find. And I couldn't help myself to think about Donald Trump when I was thinking of this talk. I don't know if you know what he means with the weave, and I felt a little bit about this.
You know what the weave is? I'll talk about like 9 different things that they all come back brilliantly together. And it's like, and friends of mine that are like English professors, they say, it's the most brilliant thing I've ever seen. The weave.
Well, I do the weave, but I'm a bit more humble. I don't think it's the most brilliant, but I hope that at the end it comes together and that we can have a nice discussion.
You know, the way.
So, um, so in 2016, a.r.t.e.s Forum, which is an online platform for researchers doing predominantly fundamental biomedical research on dementia, they published this timeline as a gift to its subscribers, mainly neurologists, psychiatrists, geneticists, but also people from research facilities linked to the pharmaceutical industry. So it's as I said, mostly fundamental research. And as it can often be found in medical textbooks, the history of Alzheimer's disease here is portrayed in a linear, evolutionary way of accumulating knowledge. It is also a profoundly neurocentric way of telling this history. For instance, the period between 1910, when Alzheimer's disease was coined by Emil Kraepelin, at that time meaning only the early onset form, in his famous psychiatric textbook, and the 1980s, when Alzheimer's disease, when the DSM-3 changed the way of thinking psychiatrists to a neo-Kraepelinian way of symptom-based neuropathology, nothing seems to happen. So there's a big gap in this timeline. However, that period that was dominated by post-Freudian, more psychodynamic ways of thinking mental illness produced important studies in which the origin of dementia was a question of personalities, especially a rigid personality, and ways of adapting to life stress and strain. So it was much more psychological etiology than today, the brain-based one. And I only mention this, first of all, to show you that the way we tell histories and science histories is also situated here through a neuro focus, but also because what I found fascinating when I started for the first time to look at Alzheimer's disease in Brazil, it had just arrived. So people were starting to read about it. And when I interviewed, especially caregivers, they all had the explanatory models that were used by, for example, Harvard professors Rothberg, who made many of these studies in the 1940s and 50s, exactly talking about, for example, my mother was always a very rigid person. She was not easygoing, which is a major value in Brazil. And also she said, also the explanation, well, she was not able to deal with life stress and strains, so she had a hard childhood, for example. So these US American explanatory models moved actually to South America, and other studies, I think it was in Colombia, also found something very similar. So which I found really interesting, how certain ways of looking at a disease category can change over time and also get transformed over time. Of course, in Brazil, this has also massively changed because dementia became a medical category that is today well known. So we can see here an epistemic situatedness that is grounded in a neurocentric way of framing dementia by the a.r.t.e.s Forum. The timeline further relates to the dominant paradigm underlying most of dementia research and what German Barrios, a British historian of psychiatry, called the cognitive paradigm. And you probably all have an older family member who started at a certain age to do more crossword puzzles or Sudoku or learning a new language. The brain conceived as a muscle, so use it or lose it. But this was a weak way of prevention, since Alzheimer's societies and others also published what Anne Robertson called apocalyptic numbers, so an avalanche of dementia cases. And as a result, preventive measures through brain training seem rather uncertain in its outcome. So in other words, people were doing it, but I don't think that people were very optimistic, actually, that there could be a big outcome because they received two messages. So the brain is like a muscle, you have to train it, but at the same time, we have an avalanche of Alzheimer cases, as you can see in the article up there in the picture. So just to mention, the cognitive paradigm is Berrios, who said that the impairment of cognition is sufficient to define dementia. And he thinks actually, and this is, I think, an article from the 90s, if I'm not wrong, actually he's saying that this is not true. It's much more complex. And this is true, actually. If we look now at dementia prevention, that shows the complexity, actually. And if you, like me, like to follow health news in the media, maybe a little bit hypochondriac, you're probably aware that in 2017, there was a widely mediatized Lancet report, a carrier of major hope, claiming that 1/3 of dementia cases could be prevented when 9 modifiable risk factors were taken care of. And this was really a major sensation because rather than being regarded as a danger, a God-given or genetic condition lying under entirely beyond human control, dementia is now seen as a risk that to a certain degree arises from our decisions and actions that eventually could be even controlled. At least that's the main message we get. And in fact, it could be more correct to speak about risk reduction and not prevention. So there's a whole debate on it. I won't get into it. But in all these articles, people talk about prevention. And then two other reports followed. So in 2020 and 2024, and this year, so altogether 14 modifiable risk factors account after the authors for almost half of dementia cases worldwide. So what they say is actually, if you control for these factors, half of the cases can be prevented, which is a really hopeful message. However, of course, it's not so easy as this. And in all these reports, you always see this snake that you see here on the right side, and you see the risk factors and their importance. It changed a little bit between the reports, but you can see that in early life, it's less education, and this green line goes all over the light course, and then there are some that are in midlife, more important, and then continue until old age, and then are others, social isolation, air pollution, and visual loss, which are most important, apparently, when it comes to older age. And what is interesting also that although education is still an important factor, most of these newer risk factors are not brain-centered anymore as it was before, but embeds dementia within a model that, in terms of risk factor, is similar to other chronic diseases, for instance, cancer. Social isolation further, for cancer, for example, there's also hypertension and obesity and smoking, etc. So it's really similar. And social isolation further links dementia to the social world, which is also quite new in terms of thinking a brain-based disease as dementia. And then there's also air pollution, which is quite astonishing, a rarely discussed aspect, actually, because it's not so easy to change, and which is actually a political aspect. And modifiable here means prevention that is beyond individual possibilities, of course. And as I want to argue, practically all other risk factors are also sociopolitical entities and only partial individual ones. So as you can see, it's a hopeful message. That's a book actually that I found at Hamburg Hauptbahnhof in a bookshop. So there's the claim actually that now all of a sudden you can not only prevent but also cure dementia, which is of course grossly exaggerated, but you can see that this paradigm change carries a lot of hope for many people, at least if you buy the message. So, and how recent actually this change is, you can see by this quote that in 2015, so really recently, Alzheimer Europe still argued that there's no conclusive evidence to suggest that any particular group of people is more or less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. Race, profession, geographical, and socioeconomic situation are not determinants of the disease, although there's mounting evidence to suggest that people with a higher level of education are at less risk. However, if you look at this, how can dementia be the same for everybody when we know that the risk factors mentioned in the Lancet report are much more often found in disadvantaged groups? So you can see that this is a major change of thought in the sense that if you say that it's linked to certain diseases and certain conditions, of course, you also have to admit that conditions are not equally distributed. Most of them, of course. And not that the idea of modifiable risk factors did not exist before, but as I said, it was a way of thinking that was really at the margins of biomedical thinking. For instance, Alan Roses, who passed away some years ago, and he was one of the major, most important US American researchers on dementia, he established already in the 1990s a link between heart disease and Alzheimer's disease based on the insight that the APOE4 gene, actually the most important gene involved in Alzheimer's disease, is also responsible for the fat transport in the body. However, the same year Roses established this link, which is also revolutionary at that time, it was in 1993, the first dementia drug, Tacrine, arrived on the market. And Tacrine was not effective in most cases. It had a very small impact actually on cognition and major side effects, especially liver damage, and it's not being prescribed anymore, it's forbidden. But just like the 4 currently existing prescribed drugs that all have a small effect on cognition and activities of daily living, people hang on it because they are major carriers of hope again. And as a result, although Alan Roses provided so-called hard facts, his theory that taking care of your heart health is also good for preventing Alzheimer's disease received little attention at that time. Not today anymore, because it's one of the risk factors. And in an interview with neurologist Rob Friedland from the University of Louisville in the States, he was one of the early researchers who already at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, was talking about lifestyle actually as a risk factor as it is today. And he told me, so I just read this quote, sometimes in the late 90s, early 2000s, I presented a paper on the relationship between lifestyle factors and dementia risk. At the meeting, I was invited to speak at a press conference by the Alzheimer's Association. I spoke about our work and my suggestion that the available literature suggested that it was wise for people to avoid smoking, manage their blood pressure and diabetes, avoid obesity, live a life with high levels of physical and mental activity, avoid a high-fat diet, and avoid head injuries. When I finished, someone from the Alzheimer's Association got up and raised his hands out wide to the right and left for emphasis and said, wait, Dr. Friedland's suggestions have not yet been verified by a double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trial. And I explained that what I had recommended was already known to be good for people anyway. There was nothing I proposed that could possibly be harmful. And I think the problem is that many people cannot see the forest for the trees in their search for scientific rigor. They forget that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So I think this quote is very interesting in the sense that it shows what I try to call epistemic situatedness and science knowledge is really embedded at certain times in certain framings, actually. So at that time, people did not seem to be ready to accept such a not brain-based explanation for dementia. And additionally, Tacrine just came out. So people were hoping that a blockbuster drug could be efficient and do the job. So just as a wrap up of what I call the new dementia, with the Lancet report, it was kind of opening up the cognitive paradigm from barriers. So while the old dementia is focused on cognitive impairment and prevention is this rather loose understanding of brain training, use it and lose it. And in the 90s also, there were a lot of genetic explanation. Margaret Lock wrote a book about it. The new dementia, especially after the Lancet reports, means actually that the brain is embedded in the wider body of the individual and in the environment. However, how could it come to this? And it was already at the end of the 1990s that the pharmaceutical industry became aware that their medications did not work, and they don't work until today. So in 1997, I think it was Pfizer who gave the International Psychogeriatric Association an unlimited funding. Oh, I'm dreaming about this. And they made major conferences and educational material about BPSD, which is behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. Why is this important? Because it was for the first time that the cognitive paradigm was opened up through the notion that it's not only cognition we are interested in, but also psychological symptoms and behavioral symptoms. And of course, the translation of BPSD happened through major interventions of medication. So the new antipsychotics, for example, antidepressants. They tried to label also the traditional medications like Tacrine. So I won't go to, I wrote an article about it. You can see the reference here because it was a major movement. I just mentioned it because I think it was important, because it was maybe the first time that the biomedical research community acknowledged that dementia is not only about cognition. And of course, psychologists and social workers, they were talking before about it, but they were marginalized. They were not hierarchically, they were less considered. The new dementia also implicits early detection and early intervention, so especially around biomarkers and mild cognitive impairment. One of the arguments for this is actually that the medications don't work because they're given when symptoms are already noticeable, and this is already too late, and so the decline is already too advanced to really stop it. So the earlier you do it, the earlier it would be better. And I also wrote an article about it. The earlier, the better, which was also majorly pushed by the pharmaceutical industry. And then another process, which I think people rarely talk about it, is the vascularization of Alzheimer's disease. I don't know if you know a little bit about it, but in the old times, when it still exists, there's a separation between Alzheimer's disease, which is always the major category everybody talks about, and vascularization and vascular disease. And vascular it's made and more and more actually in the vascular dementia, all these cardiovascular risk factors are already included, but it was a minor category. It was not important because people were predominantly talking about Alzheimer's disease. And so now the vascular disease risk factors are also part of Alzheimer's disease. And I think this is very important. So it existed actually already, but now people think the overlap between these two conditions is much bigger. So Alzheimer's disease actually became a new meaning through these risk factors. And there are, of course, then other theories like the microbiome is very fashionable at the moment. And genetics became less and less important as an explanation. So just to show you that vascular disease became part of Alzheimer's disease, so two quotes, one from Davy, he said, Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia frequently coexist and their separation may well be a false dichotomy. So he's saying actually that pure Alzheimer's we find very rarely, and most of them are mixed, so the two together. So to say Alzheimer's disease is the most important and vascular is less is actually a wrong dichotomy. And Sperling, a major researcher in the US, he said large cohort studies have implicated multiple health factors that may increase the risk for developing cognitive decline and dementia thought to be caused by Alzheimer's disease. In particular, vascular risk factors such as hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and diabetes have been associated with an increased risk of dementia. So you see the Lancet report actually at least partly existed already in the less important vascular disease discourses. So if there are modifiable risk factors involved, several longitudinal studies tried then to lower the dementia incidence by targeting these risk factors, which is, of course, logic. The most important major study, I'm sure you heard about it, is the Finnish finger study that was also reproduced in many other countries. And I think it's still going on, I'm not sure. And another one is the Dutch Prediva study that you see here. The studies evaluating the effect of 6 to 8 years of nurse-led intensive vascular care on incident dementia in community-dwelling older people. So it's quite a long study, a very expensive one, and they are aged between 70 and 78. And so it was more or less like 4 monthly visits to a practice nurse who gave individually tailored lifestyle advice like smoking, diet, physical activity, weight, and blood pressure. And if indicated, pharmacological treatment was also started or optimized according to the prevailing guidelines. So what came out of it? Van Middelaar, he wrote, overall, no preventive effect of the intervention was found. And this is a major deception, of course, because the logic is there. So if we have risk factors that are implicated, we can work on them, right? However, there was a small impact that was seen in a subgroup who had untreated hypertension at the beginning of the study. But overall, there was no. But interesting for my argument is actually the explanation that people found for this no effect. So Fagan, for example, wrote that people in Holland have already an excellent access to health, to social and education system. And he says a major impact might have been noticeable in the context of a country with a less efficient healthcare system. So this, to a certain point, means actually that individual efforts are only successful, at least when looking at larger populations, when embedded in well-functioning healthcare and education systems. So this also is a major change in the way we think about dementia as a brain disease. And then another surprising new insight, and you probably all read about it in the media, became increasingly well known. Different from the apocalyptic numbers of Alzheimer's societies, and they are true in terms of total number of dementia because of the aging of many societies, in some countries, dementia cases actually declined. So in some richer countries, and you can see here, there are many more, but here's studies from the US, Holland, Sweden, England, Germany, and many others. The reason is that probably these richer countries have a healthcare system that takes care of these risk factors associated. So the cardiovascular, diabetes, depression, etc., are better controlled than it was before. And this is also can be shown by another Lancet report that is less often quoted than the other three ones. It is the Mukadam et al. And Livingstone, who was implicated in the other three, is also part of the many authors here. They show actually that close to 1 in 2 cases of dementia could be preventable in low to middle income countries. And of course, as you all can guess, this is because the prevalence of risk factors is in poorer countries much higher than in richer countries. So however, you can ask, for example, in the US, we know that there's a lot of obesity, and diabetes is a lot of diabetes is not treated, at least compared to other rich countries, because medications are too expensive. So how can it be that a country where, for example, obesity is so high, that you can say numbers go down? And what I want to show you is actually that these probably are privileged groups within these countries. So as you can see here, more recent studies then looked at subgroups, showing that national claims regarding dementia numbers don't make sense. And so here are some examples. So Weiss, so you see, they are all recent studies, 21, 22. And Weiss, for example, he said the greatest potential for dementia prevention was observed among non-Hispanic, Black, and Hispanic men and women, supporting an intersectionality approach and underscoring the need for culturally sensitive intervention and public health initiatives to address the growing burden of dementia. And Lee writes, a large fraction of dementia cases in the US were associated with potentially modifiable risk factors, especially for Black and Hispanic individuals. And in the context of New Zealand, Mao et al. Write, New Zealand has higher dementia prevention potential than worldwide estimates, with high prevalences of untreated hearing loss and obesity. Hearing loss is also a major risk factor. The relative contribution of individual risk factors varies by ethnic group. And of course, hearing loss and social isolation. So many of these risk factors from the Lancet report can be questioned, at least when they are treated individually. So hearing loss and social isolation, in my opinion, are very closely related to each other. If you don't hear well, you have less contacts and your brain gets less stimulated. So I think separating the risk factors is also highly problematic. And just a last example by Hoffman, our findings highlight the importance of examining risk factors of ADRD regionally and within sex and race ethnic groups to favor dementia risk reduction strategy. So, of course, you can see now that if you look closer, disadvantaged groups have much more the risk factors and also have higher incidence of dementia. And then, of course, what happened once these studies were published? And right at the beginning afterwards, and you can see here,
research suggests that 1 in 3 cases of dementia worldwide could be prevented if we looked after ourselves better. A report in The Lancet, which combines the work of 24 international experts, highlights 9 risk factors as particularly important. These include learning new things, eating and drinking well, not smoking, and limiting hearing loss.
The contribution of actually managing your risks a little bit more effectively, and diet is part of those risks. And there are 9 bits to that, and they vary from blood pressure to smoking, not to drinking too much alcohol, to physical exertion, to social isolation, to hearing. You know, there's a whole list of them. Most of them actually relatively easy to do and cheap.
Which suggests that one.
Yeah, and cheap. On the other hand, here you see Sperling. I mentioned her before. I won't play it for you because it's too long, but she's actually saying that she translates the same study outcomes into a medication cocktail. So she said many researchers believe successful treatment will eventually involve a cocktail of medications aimed at several targets, similar to current state-of-the-art treatments for many cancers and AIDS. So you can see 2 ways of translating this knowledge. And of course, also in the US, you can see that lifestyle is important. In Europe, you can see medication studies. However,
which suggests that 1 in 3.
Oops. So I looked at early intervention studies that look at dementia prevention. And the same tendency actually can be seen here. The original table is much, much longer, but you can see a certain tendency which is not absolute. I mean, I really have to say that. But there is a tendency that in the US, the trials are much more drug related, while in Europe, the dementia prevention at the right, you can see the finger study that I mentioned before, that they look much more at lifestyle and cardiovascular risk factors. And this is another part of the table, which is much longer in the original article, but also there you can see again drug versus cardiovascular risk factors. And we could ask ourselves if Europeans might get a different message regarding preventive practices when compared to Americans, right? So another example I want to tell you, and that's in the same place, is the situatedness of knowledge transfer is the reaction to the recent outcome of clinical trials of the medication aducanumab. As you probably know, for years, dementia pharmaceuticals were developed based on the amyloid hypothesis, in which the accumulation of beta amyloid in the brain is the explanation for cognitive decline. And over 200 trials costing millions and millions of dollars were abandoned over the year just because these medications based on this logic did not work. And aducanumab was then a major carrier of hope. It was actually so hopeful that the American allowed a much quicker access to the market. So it was so it didn't have to go through all the stages as other medications because it was considered such an important breakthrough in development. However, it was also based on the beta amyloid hypothesis. However, arguing that they were looking much more at the origin of the disease and not only on symptoms than as other medications. And what I want to show you, just to say again, argue again that there's a situatedness. So David Holtzman from Washington University, he said, even though this trial was in the early symptomatic phase of Alzheimer's disease, it's still in the phase when beta amyloid is no longer likely to be the driving process, but where tau and inflammation probably are. I think beta amyloid is still a good target, etc., etc. So he is thinking actually one should continue with this logic and just refine studies. So there's so he's one of the scientists who think that this model is not yet dead, and many of them also think it's just a question of giving it to people earlier when the decline is not yet so accentuated, and then it would actually work, which is ethically, of course, extremely complicated because no prediction is there that can guarantee that. So you would have to give medication to people who might not even get dementia. On the other hand, and again, I do a kind of dichotomization, which of course needs to be much more nuanced. But when you look at European research, and I read these two quotes just to show you how different this same scientific insight can be interpreted. So Stefano Sensi from Italy says, the failure of the phase 3 aducanumab trial is another warning that the field must take a different approach. Some authors have already called for a rejection of the amyloid hypothesis. Alzheimer's disease is a multifactorial condition in which, along with beta amyloid accumulation, the convergence of many genetic, environmental, vascular, metabolic, and inflammatory factors promotes the neurodegenerative process. We need to remind ourselves that a third of Alzheimer's disease cases are strongly dependent on the concerted activity of modified factors like low education, midlife hypertension, midlife obesity, diabetes, physical inactivity, smoking, and depression. So he's quoting, of course, the Lancet report. It is time to take up the challenge of complexity, very different from the American beta amyloid defender. And very quickly, Kasper Kapp from Denmark. It has been known for many years that the amyloid hypothesis cannot be correct. The reason it survives is because it is appealingly simple and offers a one-sided treatment strategy that pharma can pursue easily by antibodies and inhibitors. Unfortunately, these people include, because of the paradigm's previous popularity, major opinion leaders and big pharma with the responsibility for listening to only some key opinion makers of the dominating paradigm in the time of its sunset. So these are very strong critics, and Kaspar Kapp's critic also relates to what Karin Knorr-Cetina calls an epistemic machinery. So he describes actually the machine, this force that is behind these special forces that come from the pharmaceutical industry, but also from prescribing doctors, etc., that keep a paradigm alive, although for years it has been shown that it doesn't work. So, yeah. So what I wanted to tell you with all these examples that I was mentioning until now is that dementia prevention is a hopeful category. It is a major event, but it depends how it is being framed. So it gets problematic when it's not situated. We can ask ourselves, as I did at the beginning, are we talking actually about prevention or risk reduction? So there's a whole debate about it. In Canada, many call it risk reduction. And then once we situate it, we also see that it's non-specific to dementia, because all these risk factors are also mentioned when you talk about, for example, about successful aging, active aging, and healthy aging. The same risk factors are also mentioned and related to other chronic diseases or aging in general. It's highly problematic if you think that prevention is individualizing. So you are responsible for doing prevention. And as I have shown, it's a major socio-political phenomenon, especially linked to access to education and healthcare, as the epidemiological studies really show very clearly. It's problematic if we don't acknowledge that there is a certain pharmaceuticalization at work. So the role of the pharmaceutical industry pushing certain explanations. And as we all know, in the United States, they have much more power than in Europe, where the industry is more regulated. And of course, we can talk about stigma and responsibilization. If we say, for example, you did not do enough prevention, so you're not a good citizen. Although there's a beautiful article by Matthias Leanza who relativizes this claim. And just as a last point, I want to very, very quickly talk about my research in Brazil, where we also looked at dementia prevention. And what we have to say is that all these risk factors mentioned in the Lancet report are extremely high. Surprisingly, for example, depression. We always have this smiley image of Brazil, people are dancing samba, but apparently, especially for older people, depression and social isolation are very high, but also hypertension, diabetes, and more actually growing and not declining. What is also interesting is I did a research in the media, and it was in 1979 the first time mentioned, and it was said that this was attacking the United States. So it was a disease category that had nothing to do with Brazil. It was something of the modern world it's a US American category. And then in 1993, in the Jornal do Brasil, it was the first time mentioned actually that it also was something relating to Brazilians. And this made a major change in Brazil, because dementia before in Brazil was a family affair. So family had to take care of. And when and it was called Kaduku. So it was like a slowly sliding into another world by older people. So it was called actually part of aging. However, when people, which is sometimes part of dementia, become aggressive or unpleasant, then it was also highly stigmatized madness. And people were sometimes came into psychiatric hospitals. What is also interesting, and again, going back to epistemic situatedness, that early epidemiological studies, so once Brazilians became aware, of course, they started to do epidemiological studies, and all of them, and here I mentioned some, so Lopes Bottina, Herrera, Caramelli, Nitrini, all the results were Brazilian studies show similar prevalence and incidence to foreign studies, as if they were saying, this is a modern disease, however, we are the same. Lately, however, now that people became more aware of the Lancet report and all these information, epidemiological studies state exactly the opposite. So people say, for example, that here in a study by Claudia Burula, this increase in dementia rates varies strongly between regions and seems to be especially elevated among illiterate people with a national mean prevalence of 7.6. So instead of saying, well, we have the same numbers as the richer countries, now Brazilians became aware, and it would be interesting to do a study actually how these arguments are made, how the conclusions are made, that in the early studies, they say it's the same as, and here lately they say it is something that is strongly related to our poor population. So we have a lot. Yeah. So, yeah, and coming back to situatedness, we could also make a hypothesis that maybe dementia epidemiologies are also linked to certain kinds of governing people. You all knew about this horrible government by Jair Bolsonaro, who was different from Trump, forbidden to run again for elections. However, before, Brazil went through a longer phase of the leftist government by Lula and then his successor, Dilma Rousseff. And with them came also better education and better access to healthcare, although not everywhere. And some studies seem to indicate that hypertension and heart disease has also slightly improved also among low-income groups, because among the richer people, I think it's pretty sure that they can take care of themselves. However, also among the poor people might show a link that the form of government and the providing good health access might make a change. And so, of course, we need more longitudinal studies on this. And then we did a study in a geriatric university clinic. So these were highly educated residents and geriatricians who were very aware of the controversies around medications. And many said also, I'm against these Alzheimer medication, but they prescribed them anyway. So they had a lot. And I had a resident from this unit some years ago. She came to Montreal to do a stage at the geriatric clinic here. And two things she observed. The first was that people got much less medication. Although they were so highly trained and critical, they prescribed much more, which might be the influence, a high influence actually of the pharmaceutical industry in Brazil. And at the same time also that there's nothing else to provide. So there's not alternative. And the second point she mentioned is that she was highly astonished that people, even with a diagnosis of dementia, were coming alone to the clinic, which in Brazil is forbidden. They are not allowed to come alone, even if they don't have dementia. So you see a certain difference of autonomy and the way older people are conceived. And I just want to show you three examples from the interviews, and I go back to that it can also result in a certain stigmatization, although these were all very caring people and they were so aware of the poor clientele they were attending. So one resident, she said, there's the cultural question that people think they only have to go to the doctor when they are very ill and they do not anything before getting sick. And then when they need help, the access to healthcare is very difficult. Another geriatrician, very bad quote I find is, they don't take these medications. Hypertension is so common, so why take this medication? Because it makes people ordinary. Hypertension is a disease of poor people. I want to have a disease of rich people, they say. And then she was especially caring, a very religious woman, and she said, vascular dementia in Brazil, Ave Maria, so she's referring to the vascular risk factors. I'm sure it's worse than in any other country. In the first world, diabetes and hypertension are well controlled. We will never get there. That's very sad. And especially the public system, which is called SUS in Brazil, that's a mess. It's difficult to have access to medications, difficult to change lifestyle, difficult to change the diet and all that. The access to healthcare is difficult because of all these patients have more ischemic events, microangiopathies. And so rates of mixed dementia and the vascular one are very high. In Ceilândia, which is a very poor neighborhood just outside of Brasilia, people are unable to buy certain medications. And if I decide to prescribe one, they get for free. It will likely be an old medication with heavy side effects. It's heartbreaking. Sometimes families can buy one medication, but not another. However, as Matthias Leanza argues, it would be too simple to call this stigma because it's much more complex. And as Leanza argues, once we call it stigma or social inequality, or as you like, implicit, there's already the idea that something is wrong. So to call it stigma also means that eventually something has to be done. So I think these, although they are blaming the people, I think these people, these geriatricians, they were very aware also how there was no hope for these people. This was either medications or nothing, and also the way, maybe different from the first two, at least the third one, she was very aware that it's much more complex than calling it stigma or non-compliance. So all in all, dementia prevention, I call it a hopeful phenomenon, although some critical scholars do not agree with me. It had a measurable positive impact on several groups where dementia incidence seems to decline. However, without situating it, we will not be able to see how much dementia prevention is also linked to social exclusion, questions of access and deservingness, stigma, and more generally living conditions. It seems to be linked even to the country we live in and social groups we are part of. Without situating this phenomenon, we would not be aware of the many forces or vectors shaping and changing constantly this medical category, from big pharma to Brazilian politicians. Thank you so much.